As we continue to get to the latest coming in from the United Nations General Assembly, where the Maldivian President Ibrahim Solih is speaking at this point, let's go back across to our correspondent, Sidhant Sibal, joining us from Washington, D.C., and Giles Gibson from Brussels. Coming to you first, Sidhant, about the address that was delivered by U.S. President Joe Biden just a short while back, touching upon a whole range of issues, but particularly talking about the backdrop in which this address comes, the AUKUS deal, which has caused that friction with the EU. Also, the US earlier has tried to reassure India that the AUKUS partnership will not take away from either the bilateral engagements or from the quadrilateral partnership that India is a part of. If you can take our viewers through the key takeaways from Joe Biden's address, specifically when it comes to the Indian point of view.
Well, Molly, one of the key focus area when it comes to India was the mention of the Quad. The US President mentioned about the elevation of the Quad, mentioning India in that reference about Quad, and saying that Quad basically focuses on health, on climate and on emerging technologies. He of course mentioned Indo-Pacific as well. It's obviously for the first time that Quad has been mentioned by any US President during his UNGA speech, and of course this year only Quad was formalized. In few days from now, Quad will be meeting in the building behind me, and the Indian Prime Minister will be visiting Washington for that. But if you look at the speech made by the US President, he also talked about other global issues, COVID crisis, climate change. In fact, he mentioned Xinjiang as well. This is surely going to rile up the Chinese. We can expect a reaction coming from China very soon over that development. But he also said that US will increase its commitments when it comes to vaccine. Tomorrow, of course, the vaccine COVID crisis summit takes place, in which there will be participation from the Indian side as well. And then, of course, there are a number of bilaterals lined up as well. But this long speech is essentially a speech on as to how Washington engages with the rest of the world. He clearly said that we are back on the table, and talked about how the US government plans to, in a sense, further its policy, specifically when it comes to human rights, on furtherance of democracy. He also referred to Afghanistan as well. In fact, the Afghan Republic's envoy Ghulam Isaaqzai was sitting in the UN General Assembly hall when he was addressing, and there is a big question mark as to who will address Afghanistan. As of now, Ghulam Isaaqzai is expected to address, but remember, he represents the Afghan Republic, the former Afghan government, the Ghani-led government, and so far Taliban hasn't sent any note verbal to UN as to who represents the government now. But clearly, when it comes to the focus areas on China, he did not refer to China directly, but many times talked about how rules-based order has been impacted. He talked about the European Union, the engagement with European Union, and also mentioned about the global hotspots, how crisis is emerging, and talked about how there needs to be a consensus. But largely, this is a statement, this is a policy statement that will be looked forward to for a long time. In fact, it will be dissected deeply, and the entire comment made by him is something that the global capitals will be closely reading as to how Washington re-engages with the world after the Trump presidency.
Absolutely. Stay with me, Sidhant. Let's also get in a quick update from our correspondent, Susan Teherani, who is with us from New York. Susan, very crucial statements that have been delivered by the American president as a part of his debut address at the United Nations General Assembly as the president, talking particularly about countering China, dealing with counter-terrorism measures, the Afghanistan crisis. Those have been statements that have been made in the past, but today's tone and tenor tells us a lot about the direction that America's foreign policy will be taking.
Absolutely. Really, Joe Biden, what he hoped to do was really set the course for a new foreign policy direction for his administration, really saying that, quote unquote, fighting the wars of the past really doesn't make sense, and moving forward, there has to really be a collective collective and cooperative approach in challenges that we have in the future. He really hammered in on the pandemic, and he started by posing questions on which direction the world wants to go. But it was interesting that he really said that we're turning the page. He asked the international community which direction they want to go, whether they want to cooperate with the United States or not. And he also mentioned that America will lead with its allies, and it's up to the allies to really come and cooperate with the United States or not. I think that was very interesting, that he really wanted to set in stone America's leadership role, taking the stage for the first time as the U.S. president. He did talk about Afghanistan. He sort of took somewhat of a victory lap, saying that for the first time as U.S. president in 20 years, he's the one that takes the helm at the United Nations, the stage where U.S. forces are not in Afghanistan, and the so-called war in Afghanistan is over. He did allude to the fact that there was a terrorist attack in Kabul. He talked about differing counterterrorism measures from 2001, saying that the United States is not the same United States as 9/11, that the counterterrorism measures are more advanced. But really, yes, whether directly or indirectly, honing in on China and authoritarian regimes, some say Russia as well, and then wrapping up with, you know, something that American presidents usually do, and that is focusing on America's liberal democracy stance, and saying that ultimately that's the way to go. But there is one thing that's important to note, and that's the fact that critics will say, while Joe Biden did focus on a cooperative stance and really wanted to send this message that he is keen on intense diplomacy, at least here at the United Nations.
We've lost that line there with Susan, but taking that point across, Giles, like we discussed earlier, for a lot of the statements that have been made by the American president, one does assess that, like we discussed, he has tried to assure his EU partners that America stands with its allies in the backdrop of the AUKUS deal as well and the resultant friction. What, in the broad sense, has been the EU stance on the AUKUS deal? We've had some very hard-hitting statements coming in from Ursula von der Leyen as well.
Yeah, that's right. We've seen the French in particular pushing back very strongly against the AUKUS deal, the French recalling their ambassador to Washington as a way of signalling their fury. We've also seen the European Commission and the European Union really lining up behind France in that entire dispute. But listening to this speech, you did hear some echoes of what European leaders have been saying in recent days about climate change. We saw President Biden, of course, no surprise there, talking a lot about climate change, saying that it is a borderless climate crisis, really sending this message that it's not up to individual countries to fight this crisis, but that there has to be universal action, that countries have to get together to fight climate change. And I was covering last week the State of the Union speech by Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, to the European Parliament down in Strasbourg. And we saw a very similar message from her, talking about how the world needs to get together to fight climate change. And just like Joe Biden as well, we saw Ursula von der Leyen throwing it forward to that COP26 United Nations Climate Change Conference that's coming up in just a couple of months' time in Glasgow in the UK. So we saw Joe Biden, in the same way that we saw Ursula von der Leyen do in her speech last week, really putting the pressure on world leaders to get ready for that crucial conference that's coming up in November.
WION now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.